Hello, everybody. So this is the eutrophication lecture. I wanted to spend some time thinking, introducing a little bit about watersheds before we get into eutrophication. So when we think of a watershed, that is basically think of a plot of land that you basically can dump water on where it rains and then where that drains to. Okay. And so if you look at a spot on, let's say, a lake, it's basically all the land that drains into a lake. For a river, it's a little different in the sense that it's, everything basically upstream that drains to a certain point. But there's different ways to talk about this: catchment, drainage basin, watershed, all basically the same words. Now, when humans change watersheds, what they do is change the water bodies that those watersheds basically drain into. And what we see is the effect of the alteration is dependent essentially on how close it is, on the proximity. And we see that if, an alteration is relatively far away from the actual water, let's say this is fertilizer addition or pesticide addition or something, it has time to basically get filtered out by the natural habitat before it gets into the aquatic habitat. So when you think of how in a lake scenario, a lot of people really like having their nice big home on the lake with a nice lawn that has no weeds and is really green lawn. And unfortunately, that's like just a recipe for disaster. If everybody has that, it's going to be bad. So what we see is for like northern lakes, like here in Wisconsin, what we have is at some point between let me put it this way. If you have over 75% of the lake, let's say the edge of the lake as its natural cover, the lake generally is okay. But if it's less than 60% forested, so basically if a bunch of people start putting homes along the lake, cutting down the forest so they can watch the lake from their living room, the lake will turn gross and the water quality will degrade. So what I'm going to talk about kind of for part of this lecture is how do we balance the human use of a lake and the natural needs of a lake, so they don't compete with each other necessarily. So this is a picture of Whitewater Lake, and what we see is basically the entire lake is surrounded by homes, lake cabins, people with docks, and lawns going directly up into the lake. So when we're talking about that 60 to 75% threshold, the water quality of the lake is going to go down. All the alterations that these people are doing mean the water quality suffers. So you might ask, well, what are you supposed to do, right? Like, how do you have a cabin on a lake and still enjoy the lake? Well, I'm actually pretty proud of what my uncle did. He didn't live on Whitewater Lake, but what he did was he had a lake where he left the natural shoreline. This was what the natural shoreline was like, and it had all these reeds in here. And he decided not to cut down those reeds, which that would have been a really big problem. So this is like one of those panoramic 180-degree photos. But if he would have cut down all these reeds, whenever the waves would come in, it would have eroded his shoreline really, really badly. So what he did was had a long dock, and that long dock went out past the reeds, and it was relatively shallow, still just a couple feet deep out there. And that's how they enjoyed their lake. And this was not their lake cabin. Rather than have a lake cabin, cut down all these trees, put a cabin there, what they did was they put a little boathouse to house. It was just kind of like a shed, and they slept in it every once in a while. But they built a cabin up farther away from the lake so that they could They could enjoy the lake, but they kept that forested buffer that really helped the water quality of the lake. So when we think about balancing this, the human use of the lake versus the natural needs of the lake, I think that there are ways to do this. We can't just say all lakes nobody can be on, right? But given some smart planning that is not this, right? We can protect the lake while still using the lake for recreation and fishing and all sorts of different things. So one thing I want to talk about is this idea of eutrophication. So eutrophication is what happens when a lake gets like really green and yucky. So what's happening is you're increasing the rate of rate of supply of organic matter in the system. Basically, what this means is you put a bunch of fertilizer into the water, a bunch of nutrients in the water. The ecosystem responds by having a ton of algae growth. So generally, this is phosphorus, but nitrogen can do it a little bit. So you might ask, well, where do those nutrients come from? And the main thing is, I probably should have put egg runoff first, but that's the biggest thing. Where if you have a lot of fertilizer coming from fields, running off into the streams and then into the lakes, it kind of just sits there then in the lakes, and those lakes really respond by growing algae. Septic tanks and sewage treatment plants that aren't working very well, those can create problems, but that is, not as big of a problem unless, a bunch of people's septic tanks around a lake are not working. So, what essentially happens? What you've got is, if we have a picture of a food web here, what you've got is a bunch of phytoplankton, a bunch of algae that are producing organic matter. When you increase the supply of nutrients to the producers, this part of the food web explodes and you get a super green lake. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that there is more food to the consumers, because these things can't live in that kind of lake, basically, and what it does is just kind of makes this cycle of the food web just much more dominant. So a bunch of algae grow, the algae dies, bacteria eat it, putting nutrients back into the water, which go back to the algae. So if you look at a lake, you have these two words, oligotrophic and eutrophic. Eutrophic lakes are those really green lakes. Oligotrophic lakes are really clear lakes. And what happens is, because there is so much organic matter being created here, so many algae growing, what they do is those algae die and then they have to decay, which gets rid of oxygen. So the whole bottom portion of the lake, termed the hypolimnia, and don't worry, I'm not gonna quiz you on those words. The bottom of the lake just basically runs out of oxygen. And whereas a pristine clear lake will have plenty of oxygen in the bottom part of the lake. So the question might be asking, okay, so how do we prevent this? First off, the main, most important thing, you need to stop nutrient inputs, right? So if a field is a bunch of fertilizers running off from a field, the lake is going to have no chance. Even if the whole lakeshore is completely undeveloped, doesn't have a bunch of cabins around it, you need to stop those nutrients before they get into the lake. So keeping the buffer of native habitat around a lake can do that, but again, you still need to stop those the fertilizer additions around where lakes are going to be. Then, if the lake is somewhat eutrophic already. There has been mixed results with actually extracting nutrients from the lake itself. You need to stop those nutrients going in the first place, but then some concerted efforts can flip the lake from that green state back to clear state, but it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. And the reason that happens is because when you have a eutrophic lake with so much algae growing, all those algae die and sink to the bottom of the lake. So whenever there's like a mixing event, so in the spring and the fall when the lake is mixing up and all of the water is moving around, or in like a really big storm or something, a whole bunch of nutrients can get resuspended back into the water and cause huge problems with the lake just having nutrients again. And so you can never really get rid of all the nutrients. It's really hard to do that because all those nutrients are trapped in those sediments. So what I would say is, if we do have a lake that looks beautiful like this, we need to spend as much time thinking about how we're going to use that lake to prevent the water quality from getting so bad. All right, that's all I have for this lecture. See y'all later.